Well, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for taking time from your busy schedule to join us. I'm pretty confident that you're going to be glad that you did. It should be a really engaging conversation today. I'm looking forward to it. We're chatting today with Shamir Duverseau, and we're going to be talking about negotiation isn't the ask, it's the experience. So I'd ask you, what if negotiation wasn't about pushing harder, but instead about designing an experience where the outcome becomes inevitable? How does that sound to you? Well, today's conversation is about reframing how we think about negotiation. As you know, that's something I like to do, strip down your preconceptions about what it means. So don't think about it as a single moment, but as an experience that actually begins long before we ever make the ask. And our guest today brings a pretty powerful perspective from years of working in complex, high stakes environments. And we're going to explore clarity as leverage, people first negotiations, and the invisible negotiations that we're leading every day, often without naming them as that or even being aware that we're engaged in a negotiation. So, welcome, Shamir. So glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here with you. This is great.
Yeah, you've got such an interesting background. I can't wait to unpack some of those layers for our listeners here. And for those of you who may not know him, Shamir Duverseau is a former enterprise marketing leader turned strategic advisor. And now he focuses on experience design, clarity, human psychology, and how they shape outcomes. And I guess you could say his work sort of sits at that intersection of influence, decision making, and sustainable leadership. And goodness knows we could use more more of that these days. So now, Shabir, let's start with I think when people hear the word negotiation, they immediately picture at the very least, if not the boardroom, they picture a conversation or the ask. But I know you take a much broader view, as do I. So how would you define negotiation? How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say I had a nice, clean definition of negotiation, right? I guess I look at negotiation as very much a process of trying to create an experience. And I guess in our ideal scenario, you'd want that experience to be win-win, and you hope that both sides of any negotiation want to be win-win. You want to create that level of balance, right? And maintain balance in terms of everyone getting ultimately what they want at the end. So when I think about negotiation, I think about that end goal of making sure that both parties end up happy. So almost like that sense of, communication is when whatever it is that you put out is what the other person is then taking in, right? They're getting that same idea across.
Yeah.
Negotiation is kind of the same thing. I feel like you won, I feel like I won, and vice versa. And once that happens, you kind of had that negotiation experience.
Yeah. And I like that you don't have a clean I think the problem is for so long we've constrained what we
Mhm.
think of as negotiation. And then we forget that we're negotiating with ourselves, with our kids, with our intimate partners every day, So, and let's talk about, because I know you take the position that long before anybody realizes that they're in one, that negotiation has actually already begun, as I alluded to in your intro. So, at what point do you think the so-called negotiation actually begins?
I think it begins once someone kind of identifies that they have a particular goal in mind, right? That there's something they want to accomplish. And of course, my background in marketing, I think about that a lot in terms of people making purchase decisions. When you think of purchase and you think of negotiation, probably the first thing for many that come to mind is buying a car. So you think about the idea of going into the car dealership, sitting down with that salesperson, having that negotiation, trying to get to the point of a price on a car. But really, that negotiation begins once you have the idea. I need to buy a car. It's time to replace what I have for
Yeah.
for whatever reason. It's got too many miles. Whatever the case may be. I think that negotiation starts at that point because at that point you're effectively negotiating with yourself.
Yep.
Am I actually going to do this? Am I going to make this decision? And then it transitions into negotiating with a brand. It then transitions into negotiating with a person, right? But the actual process kind of begins with the inception of the idea of the goal of what you're trying to
Yeah.
accomplish.
I think that's a great perspective because long before you're sitting at that table with
Mhm.
the salesperson in the dealership, you're thinking already of yourself, how much can I afford? What kind of budget am I looking for? As you say, where, what kind of cars am I willing to look at? What
Mhm.
dealerships I'm prepared to, maybe some that I wouldn't. So I think that's a great insight. And you often talk and sort of tied to that, I guess, that how the negotiation is something that's shaped before, but also after the conversation itself. So can you walk us through what that looks like in real life? Maybe some examples from your experience.
Absolutely, absolutely. So my experience and therefore my viewpoint of negotiation is really very much crafted by the fact that I work in this digital space. And I didn't start out that way when I started out working in marketing. I was working in, I guess more traditional marketing, for lack of a better way to put it. But when I started my career, it's kind of when the internet was really starting to take off. It was really starting to gain momentum. And it really caused this fundamental shift in what we did in marketing in terms of before brands really had a lot of control and a lot of power over the negotiation. So I think about being a kid. I think about, going with mom and going into Sears to
Yeah.
buy
Oh
whatever,
God,
right?
I remember those days.
Taking me back. Sears doesn't
Yeah.
even exist anymore, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think about that and I think about, if mom and dad or mom had to buy a appliance, she was pretty much beholden to that salesperson to say, this is what this appliance is, this is what it does, this is a good brand, this is a
Right.
bad brand, this is how much they run, this is how much they cost.
Yeah.
It was pretty much very confined and very much the brand was in control of the experience because they had so much of the information, right?
Yeah.
But the internet very much changed that because now this information became very democratized. And now all of a sudden I can go research and I can compare very, very easily, far more easily than I could before. And I didn't need to take someone's word for it.
Yeah.
So now here, this concept, this idea of negotiation becoming an experience, at least in my mind, really began to take root because I came to realize, okay, this isn't the same very myopic, very kind of siloed view of it that we had before. Now there are so many factors at play here, and the consumer has so much more power and so much more control in the negotiation
Yeah.
to drive it the direction they want to. Because now, if I walk into that same department store, you know, once the internet kind of took off, I had the ability to come in armed with information of saying, hey, I did some research and I can get it here at this store for this price, or I can get it at this website for this price. Are you able to match that? Are you able to give me a better deal? Right. So now it's really kind of shifted things when it comes to a negotiation standpoint. And I think that shift is really what has influenced me and influenced my view of how we think about negotiation in terms of having kind of passive and active phases that kind of
Yeah.
bounce back and forth. Again, passively in terms of what's happening in my head. Maybe I'm doing research, I'm trying to figure things out, I'm negotiating with myself, maybe even negotiating with a spouse because we're making this joint decision about should we even do this? That then transitions into negotiating maybe with a brand, whether I'm shopping online or I'm talking to someone, I'm engaged in chat, I'm on the phone, right? And then it can go passive again because now maybe I've made that purchase decision. How do I feel about that decision? The ability now to return things is far easier than it used
Yeah.
to be.
That's true.
Am I going to keep this? Is this really what I wanted? Right? You have that little moment after you make that purchase, especially if it's a high consideration purchase,
Yeah.
where you're like, okay, I just did that. Did I do the right thing? I just spent a whole lot of money. Is this
Yeah.
really what I wanted? Right? And now you're negotiating with yourself again. Like,
Yeah.
was this right? How much time do I have? Can I take this back? Like how quickly can I, right? So you have this whole process where you're kind of bouncing back and forth between active and passive negotiation. That's part of this broader experience.
Yeah. I love that. As you were saying that, I'm thinking of like some art pieces that I bought where like
Mhm.
at the time, I'm like, oh my God, I have to have this. And then
Mhm.
after I'm like, oh my God, what was it? What was I thinking? Right? How do you justify
Exactly.
that? So, and for our listeners, I want, as you were talking about that experience, having access to information, it
Mhm.
goes beyond just purchases, right? Like the thing that came to
Mhm.
mind as you were saying that was for salary negotiations, right? Or
Yep.
when you're looking for a job, way more access now if you do your homework to be able to find what is the going rate, not just at your company, but in the industry, even globally. We've got a lot more options. And I'm wondering, Shamir, is that what you like? Because I know you talk about thinking in terms of experience and how that can
Mhm.
change the power dynamic, especially for people who maybe don't feel they hold formal authority. So would it be that you're talking about when you speak to that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's the old adage that knowledge is power. And I think that adage still very much holds true, that the ability to have that knowledge gives you more power in negotiations than
Yeah.
people have ever had before. And not just because, it's a combination of things, right? On the one hand, there's more knowledge out there than
Yeah.
there probably ever has been in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that knowledge is more accessible than
Yeah.
it's ever been in the history of mankind,
Yeah.
right? With a conversation with AI will get you tons of knowledge in really seconds.
Yeah.
And that the ability to walk into any kind of negotiation empowered with that knowledge, as you mentioned, negotiating for a salary,
Yeah.
I'm making a purchase, right? All these items and that we kind of go through in life where we are kind of bargaining with
Yeah.
someone else and trying to, come to a mutual decision. all those things, we're armed with more information that we're bringing to the
Yeah.
table, more opinions that we're bringing to the table because of social media, right?
Yeah.
And all those things kind of put weight on us and create an experience.
Yeah. Well, it's funny when you say wait, because we're also kind of navigating or negotiating, if you will, the reliability of the information. There's so
Yeah,
much information, much of
100%.
which is not reliable either. So there's that kind of negotiation that takes place too. So, and it's funny when you said Sears, I can't get that out of my head. I remember we kind of grew up in a low rental apartment complex at the time. My mom worked at Sears, so we had her employee
Mhm.
discount, but we never got on brand, right? When Adidas
Right.
was popular, I'm totally dating myself here. When Adidas was a thing, we had to have North Stars. When Levi's
Mhm.
for the jeans, we always had off brand. So, and speaking of women, I know you speak sometimes about how women are constantly negotiating, right? Managing
Mhm.
expectations and aligning all the stakeholders, smoothing over friction, whether in the
Yeah.
family or outside. And not only do they, I think, typically historically not call it a negotiation, but other people have never recognized them as being master negotiators. So why do you think that work remains so invisible and what can we do about that?
I think it's because women are so taken for granted in terms of what they have to do and what they have to balance. And again, we're speaking obviously in generalities, but I
Yes.
think it's an accurate generality to say that. And because it's so much of an expectation, it's then kind of put to the side and neglected, like, and it's taken, and therefore it's taken for granted. You know, the woman is just expected to figure that out, so to speak, or maybe even someone who has a far, kind of more archaic view is, that's their job to kind of figure it out,
Yeah.
right? And once you kind of get stuck in that mentality, if that's your culture or that's the way you were raised or whatever the case is, you take for granted the fact that, the average woman, especially if she has maybe a secular job, I mean, the degree of negotiation she has to do with, perhaps a spouse, perhaps a partner, with kids, with schools and teachers, with her job and her career, right? With managing her household, like all these things are happening, and people say multitasking is a bit of a misnomer, right? That you're not really multitasking. I feel like if there's any being on this planet that gets close to actually really multitasking, it is a woman,
Yeah.
right? Because, the ability to balance all those things and keep all those things moving, to balance all and juggle all those balls at the same time and keep them moving forward, again, trying to keep them all moving toward those win-win scenarios the whole
Yeah.
time, it becomes an experience that I think oftentimes men, because we don't have the same experience,
Yeah.
it becomes more challenging for us to empathize, and therefore it becomes easier for us to take it for granted,
Yeah.
especially because in general we live in a male-dominated world.
Yeah.
That's just the
Yeah.
reality of the situation, right? So, you
Yeah, we
know,
keep thinking it's changing, and then you look at US politics and realize it hasn't. For
unfortunately.
example, it's interesting. But and as you're saying that, I'm thinking too, it's not even just all of the negotiation prowess that's needed for each of those individual things we're juggling, but the
Mhm.
act of juggling itself, right?
Yeah,
And those expectations.
absolutely.
I'm just thinking of myself, even when I had, we started late and made up for lost time. I had 3 kids in 3 years. I had a
Mm.
successful law practice. And there was that constant, when you're with the kids, you feel like you're falling down on the job. When you're at the job, you feel like you're falling down as a mother in ways that men weren't conditioned to experience that, I
Yep.
think is fair. And I'm wondering, what do you think the cost of that is? Like, not just, I think that affects a lot of women professionally, but even personally. Like when that kind of negotiation isn't named, isn't valued, isn't recognized, what's the cost of that in your view?
I think it really comes down to an attack, part of one element or part of an attack on the self-worth and self-esteem of women. I think a lot of what we do in our world, a lot of what we promote, a lot of what we call entertainment, what we call marketing,
Yeah.
very much is an attack on a woman's self-worth. And I think this just adds more weight to it because just as inherently as humans, whether male or female, it's very easy to get into a sense of, okay, I'm not doing enough.
Yeah.
And I think because so much more tends to be expected of women,
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to fall into the realm of I'm not doing enough because I'm not doing enough for my partner or my spouse. I'm not doing enough for my kids. I'm not
Yeah.
doing enough to help them at school. I'm not doing enough at work, right? There's just so many other areas of life to feel like maybe you're failing and you're falling down that just tends to compound. And as you kind of mentioned, and you said very well, right, you're trying to keep all these things in balance, right? Is everyone and everything getting the right amount of time in the right way has I kind of moved through this journey of life?
Yeah.
And the more things that you're having to balance and kind of keep at weight, the easier it is to kind of teeter-totter and kind of get off in the wrong way. And that can attack your self-worth. That can attack your self-esteem because it just creates in your mind anyway
Yeah.
another point of failure.
And not even just as you're saying, and it really struck a chord with me that, am I doing enough? Am I not doing enough? Because it actually, and it goes beyond that, right? Shamir, like it's like, am I doing enough? But also even, do I look good enough? And
Mhm.
really at its core, it's like, am I enough? I
Yeah.
mean, it really, as you
Mhm.
say, goes to the very essence of your self-esteem. So I want to give you time to talk a bit about clarity, because I know you really have incredible expertise with that. You bring that to the table for your clients. And I know you've said that clarity often creates more leverage than some of those traditional hardline tactics that we've been conditioned to see as effective negotiation, which in fact aren't. So, what does clarity actually mean from your perspective in a negotiation context?
I view clarity has and this is going to seem, I don't know, matter of fact, but I view clarity has the opposite of uncertainty.
Yeah,
Human beings, psychological and behavioral psychological studies tell us again and again that human beings do not do well with any sense of uncertainty, that
yeah,
people react in very unpredictable ways when they're faced with uncertainty. I mean, they've done studies where you could see two people fighting, a man and a woman, and the woman's, clearly visually in distress, but people will freeze and not take action because they're not sure, should I interfere? Should I
yeah,
not interfere? Is this really something that's going on? Is this for real?
yeah,
Is this uncertainty just causes people to freeze, and people tend not to take any kind of action when they're blocked with what they perceive as uncertainty.
yeah,
So the only way to block that is clarity. They tell women, if you're ever attacked, be very clear. I am in distress. I'm under attack. I need you to come here and help me.
yeah,
Make it absolutely unambiguous as to what you need, who you're asking for, right? So that clarity is what unfreezes people. It allows people to be able to fight that kind of inherent sense of uncertainty that we so often run into. And that allows people to continue to move through the process, to move through the journey of negotiation. So
yeah,
in order for negotiation to be effective, again, whether being active or passive, someone needs clarity. They need to understand, okay, like what am I doing here? What is my goal? What am I
yeah,
trying to accomplish? And there needs to be some sense of confidence too, of like, well,
yeah,
why do I want to accomplish that? Why do I feel like I deserve that salary, right? Why do I feel like I should get that car at that
yeah,
price, right? There needs to be some
yeah,
sense of worth and convincing yourself that that's the case so that you can have the confidence to bring the clarity to the situation and saying, no, 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 that's not what I want. This is
yeah.
what I want. How do I get from A to B in a way that that brings some
Yeah.
balance to this negotiation?
Well, I
Mhm.
love that perspective because I think as, women, the stats are staggering about how women tend to not ask for what they want, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of employers who are questioned about the differentials in pay go, the men asked for it. I mean,
Mhm.
it was
Yep.
that simple. And I think you've really hit to the nub. And for our listeners, I want you to take a moment and think about when those things that you're not asking for, do you have the clarity yourself on what it is that you actually want, right? And how tied to that, Shamir, how does getting clear on like constraints, maybe our motivations, decision psychology, even how can that shift outcomes for us, even when we feel that maybe there's a power imbalance?
What happens is it causes these mental shortcuts, right? So, there's a lot of work done by a man named Daniel Kahneman in terms of understanding how the brain works. And he talks about system one versus system two thinking. So system one is kind of that fast-paced thinking. Someone asks you, what's two plus two? You say four. It takes zero thought to do that, right? Versus system two, which is a lot more intense thinking, the more complicated part of the brain, where someone asks you, hey, what's 17 times 21?
Yeah.
Now, we can all kind of figure that out, but even if you're walking down the street and someone asked you that, you'd probably stop walking just to give a little bit more mental energy and say to yourself, okay, let me give me a second, let me
Yeah.
visualize this, right? This math problem. So that's that system one, system two thinking that happens. So what happens is our brains, as you can imagine, they prefer to be in system one. They
Yeah.
prefer to make it easy.
Yeah.
So our brains create these psychological shortcuts to get to system one. And these are the same psychological shortcuts that are used in marketing. So this idea of social proof is a psychological shortcut. If everyone else is doing it, then it
Yeah.
must be okay. It
Yeah.
eliminates the uncertainty, right? Then I can do it, right? So understanding these different kind of psychological shortcuts, understanding what kind of keeps us in system one thinking, those same principles can be applied to negotiation, right? So again, going into a negotiation, understanding the example you gave of a salary. Like men ask for a salary. That's social proof. It's okay for me to ask for a salary. So sometimes before going into that negotiation, doing the research not just into what salary should I get, but doing research into salary negotiations and seeing those stats
Yeah.
might influence you to say, you know what? If they can ask for it, I can ask for it too, right? That social proof eliminates a little bit of that uncertainty, gives you a shortcut to say, this is okay. I don't need to overthink this.
Yeah.
And I can go and I can ask for that particular number. I can go toward try and get these benefits or, whatever it is you may have in mind.
Yeah.
So it's understanding those mental shortcuts that you need to take to kind of get you to the place that you need to be able to move forward in the process of
Yeah.
negotiation.
I haven't heard that system one, system two thinking. That really resonates with me. And it makes so much sense. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And that clarity, as you're saying about the number, like I always encourage people as well, like practice saying the number out loud. And
Mhm.
I
Yep.
never really saw it as a clarity piece before, but as you were speaking, I think it sort of is, right? You get clarity
100%.
about what you want and
Yep.
you practice saying it to people in your family in front of the mirror so that that number, because you've got such clarity about that number being authentic
Yep.
and natural that then it resonates and gives you more power. So I love that. Now,
Absolutely.
for art of feminine negotiation, one of the things that was a big mover for me, I hadn't practicing law for a long time. I bought
Mhm.
into that hardcore, hard ass, success
Mhm.
meant that you
Mhm.
were until I had my epiphany that, it was not the most effective and it was destroyed relationships and your sense of
Mhm.
self.
Mhm.
But it's been interesting watching. There's a bit of still, I think, cultural resistance to this idea of seeing empathy and
Yep.
truly listening and trying to understand other people's perspective. And sadly, the pendulum seems to be swinging back to the caveman days where we're seeing those as soft, right? So
Mhm.
I'd love your inputs on whether you see those as strategic advantages, and if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I very much think that, so much of this goes back to culture and it goes back to, again, how you're raised and what is your moral compass and what matters and what's important to you. And for better or for worse, that's an individual thing, right? Ultimately, everyone's going to make their choice as to what matters. Now, I think empathy is critically important because you started off with the very first question, how do we define negotiation? I go into it defining it as a win-win scenario. I'm not trying to create kind of a zero-sum game here where I win and you lose and that's it and that's that, right?
Yeah.
But if that's not your mentality, if you go into it the mentality that frankly permeates our culture nowadays, which is I get to define what's best for
Yeah.
me and I get to define what's best for
That's for you.
you at your expense.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if that's where you're starting, then okay, like that's a basis for negotiation. I can't argue that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a valid or good basis for negotiation, but it's a basis for negotiation, right? But now, if I'm coming at it from the standpoint of empathy and you're coming at it from this other more kind of selfish standpoint, well, that's going to be a problem, right? Just the mere difference in viewpoint that we have is going to cause a sense of conflict in that negotiation, and it's going to kind of upset the apple cart. And as you kind of mentioned, that's exactly what we're seeing today,
Yeah.
right? We're seeing these different mentalities, whether it's in business, whether it's in politics, right? Whether it's in entertainment, in all these different fields, we're seeing these different balances constantly kind of bumping heads with each other. And people don't understand sometimes, well, why can't they make any headway? Like, why can't they work together to make a decision? Well, because the very premise they're approaching
Yeah.
making the decision is so flawed and so at conflict that they never get past that to even say, okay, can we have a rational, reasonable conversation and begin to truly kind of go back and forth and negotiate and see how we can come to the best possible outcome?
Yeah. And how does a people first approach maybe reduce some of that resistance rather than, everybody sees that as being a weaker? I mean, in my experience, even when I'm dealing with bullies, when I had my sort of epiphany and switched to this new road, sometimes calling it like not only repeating back, that active listening where you repeat back what they're saying, but I'll make their argument even
Mhm.
more in a more compelling way than they did. And
Yep.
it stops in almost always stops them dead in their tracks
Yep.
and triggers this sort of reciprocity. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the advantages or not to a people first approach and getting rid of resistance.
Yeah, no, I think people first approach is absolutely the way to go, right? Because what it does is it creates, we talked about creating this sense of clarity to combat uncertainty. The other thing that needs to be important is you have to create safety. Like
Yeah,
people need to be safe. Like anytime you have not just negotiation, but just a conversation with someone, right? If you want to have a meaningful conversation, that person has to feel safe in the conversation. And I think it's important to have that people first approach because if I'm going into it thinking, okay, how am I making you, Cindy, safe in this conversation? well, that's going to completely change the kind of the way I approach it, how I communicate with you, how I talk to you. And the only way to make you safe is to understand, okay, what could possibly be making you not feel safe right now? And how can I address that? And how can I remove that barrier so that I'm able to get past that so that you can feel safe and you can feel comfortable? And the only way we do that is if I care about Cindy. You have to matter to me. Your safety, your feeling comfortable has to matter to me. So it has to be about the person. Certainly, I have my goals and things I want to accomplish. Again, I have the purchase price I want. I have the salary I'm looking for, whatever that case may be. I may have that in mind, but you've got to matter to me too. Your goals and who you are and you feeling safe and you feeling like you clearly understand me and that you're being clearly understood has to matter to me. So I think it's really about putting energy into getting that safety so that things can
Yeah.
effectively move forward.
Nice. And what impact would you say that has on burnout? Because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about burnout and how people, when we negotiating a law, there's such friction. The late nights, I know certainly in the practice of law, it was just exhausting sometimes, right? That constant fight when there were better alternatives there. So what advice do you have, I guess, for maybe some practical ways or some of the stuff you've even talked about so that we can negotiate more effectively without that constant friction or emotional depletion, I guess, is really what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's so hard, right? Because it's not even oftentimes, and I'm sure you could speak to this from your career, right? It's not even so much what it is that you're communicating or negotiating about. It's the degree of resistance you're getting, right? That
Or
ends up
giving.
giving,
Yeah.
right? That ends up kind of draining you emotionally, right? So it's like how much friction is there? How hard is this, right? And just like anything else in physics, right? The more friction there is, the harder it is, the
Yep.
more wear there's going to be on that item, right? The more friction on the tire, the more wear, the faster it's going to wear down, and sooner you'll need to
Yep.
replace it. So, in the same sense, right, how are we thinking about that friction and how are we thinking about how to minimize that friction and how to avoid it in senses in places and times where we can't avoid it? How are we finding ways to take breaks from that friction, right, and allowing ourselves to get some relief from that, maybe by balancing that by fostering other relationships that are really more kind of energizing to us, right? That allow us to refresh ourselves, that fuel us back. And it comes down to the person because people have different personality types and different things that do energize them and refresh them, different things that do drain them. So I think, as with all things, you've got to know yourself,
Yeah.
right? You got to know kind of what pushes your buttons and what doesn't. You've got to know what fuels you, what energizes you, and what drains you, and what kind of pulls you away and wears you down, and kind of burns your fuel and causes you friction.
Yeah.
And taking that time to do that self-awareness, to kind of look in the mirror and understand yourself, is just super critically important because having that clear and honest view of yourself allows you to say, okay, now that I understand me, I
Yeah.
know what me I'm bringing to the table in
Yeah.
this particular situation, this
Yeah.
negotiation, and now I can deal with it according to knowledge and not kind of deal with it kind of where I'm the black box in this situation and
Yeah.
I don't even understand the things that are
Yeah.
that are triggering me, which is only going to cause the whole thing to be far more draining in the process.
I love that. And I think it's so important and it is so often overlooked, right? We're always focused on the other person. We need to renegotiate how we show up, right? And I was only half tongue in cheek when I'd said you are giving resistance because I found myself when I was in that mode about, how do I exert power over? How do I make sure
Yeah.
that our position is going forward? A lot of that exhaustion, it comes from that being that constant on
Absolutely.
edge as opposed to showing up with curiosity and
Mhm.
grace, right? So I'm wondering, if one of our listeners today wants to renegotiate how they show up, which is, tied to what you were just talking about, Shamir, like where they can show up with more clarity and with less force, maybe more empathy. And maybe you've already said this, but where would you suggest they start? Just for speaking of clarity, for clarity of our listeners, if somebody's going, okay, how can I renegotiate how I show up and get this clarity? What would be the starting zone for you?
I think knowing how to show up, I think is really about knowing how to have a conversation. So before even thinking about, okay, this is how I'm going to negotiate, like this is just how I'm going to talk to people.
Yeah.
I know one resource that was really a huge help to me as I kind of started kind of unpacking this in my career and kind of seeing how this affected people, even from a marketing perspective, was a book called Crucial Conversations. And that was really impactful to me just because it came at it from the standpoint of how do you have meaningful conversations with people regardless of what the goal of the conversation is, right? Maybe it's just trying to help someone with a problem, right? Maybe it's trying to coach an employee, right? Just those kinds of
Yeah.
conversations and how that flows. And then that those principles truly apply to other facets of life, including negotiations.
Yeah.
So I think a great resource, for your listeners would be that book, Crucial Conversations. I'm sure you can get it on Amazon. I'm sure that's where I got it from too. And it was just a wonderful resource in terms of just kind of reframing things in terms of how you communicate with people on a one-on-one basis in a meaningful way
Yeah.
to help things kind of move forward across multiple types of communication.
Okay, awesome. And what would you say is one negotiation that you believe more people need to start having with themselves? And again, you've probably touched on it already, but just if you were going to crystallize, look, if you here's the conversation that negotiation people are not having with themselves enough, and it could be a game changer.
I really think it's negotiating with yourself and just in terms of taking the time and putting forth the effort to understand yourself,
Yeah,
to understand both your strengths and your weaknesses, and to do that in an honest way. And a lot of times, friends, family, those who kind of truly know you, truly love you, can help you with that.
yeah,
And the balance in that is so critically key because anytime that you're trying to kind of do a self-examination, it can very easily go down the rabbit hole
yeah,
of kind of again that issue about your self-worth and
yeah,
all you're seeing is the 20 negative things and you've got like one or two things on the positive side.
yeah,
And that's not really true of most anyone, right? People tend to have relatively balanced personalities in terms of the positive and negative. But you've got to understand your positives and negatives
yeah,
because you've got to understand how they're playing against you before you can kind of take them into a situation where perhaps someone can use them against you, right? They say the best offense is a good defense. You've got to kind of understand yourself and understand where your gaps are and how you interact with things, how your mind works. Again, the things that fuel you, the things that drain you, and understanding that is going to help you to get fueled, avoid getting drained, and it's going to help you understand when you enter into a situation, okay, this is how my mind's going to deal with and interpret the situation.
yeah,
How do I prepare for that? And therefore get into it in a way that I can keep myself looking at people first, including myself in that
yeah.
equation. Yeah.
Well, and I'm glad you spoke to that balance piece, right? About because it's true. And I think women are more likely conditioned to this than men, but I think it crosses gender where we could, at the drop of a hat, come up with 100 things we think we did wrong today,
Yep.
but struggle to come by. And I do a lot of live workshops and whenever it's like with an all-female audience, and I ask them to start to, at one point, I want you to sit down and think about list 25 things about yourself that you can love or qualities that you admire, respect. And invariably, like the vast majority of the room sit there absolutely shell-shocked, unable to come up with things that they can love or appreciate about themselves. And as you were speaking, Shamir, it ties me back to that clarity piece as well, right? If we're going to go
Mhm.
out and negotiate, I think often we spend so much energy negotiating for things that aren't our true desires, right? If we don't have that clarity about what
Mhm.
it is we really want, what matters to us, then we're shooting ourselves before we even get out of the gate. Well, this has
Absolutely.
been lovely, Shamir, and I can't believe our time's gone really quickly. Luckily, we both speak fast, so we got double the information in here, which is awesome. And I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had? It doesn't have to be about negotiation or anything we've talked about. One of those aha moments for you that makes you see things
Wow.
differently.
Probably that I needed to make sure that I was centering my life around the things that mattered most to me. When I started my own business, it wasn't really fostered out of an idea of like, oh, I really want to be an entrepreneur or, I really want to be my own boss. Like, in fact, the idea of doing that was actually pretty fearful to me because I don't like uncertainty.
Yeah.
And, it's nice to work for a large company and think, okay, I can count on my paycheck coming, on these days, right? But the one thing I realized is that there were things in my life that were really important to me, things where I wanted to spend the best of my time and my energy. And the ability to not have control of to do that the way I wanted to really bothered me.
Yeah.
So I had to kind of like refocus things and kind of say, well, let's make the big rock in my life the things that I want to be the big rock in my life. And then the small rocks can kind of fall around that. And that shift really helped me a ton, right? It relaxed me. It gave me far more satisfaction, far more purpose, far more meaning in my life because I was making the main thing that I wanted to be, and not kind of what was being dictated to me by needing to pay a bill or needing to meet up to someone's expectation of an employee or a manager or all those other things that kind of influence your life that maybe aren't the most important thing
Yes.
to you in your life.
Yeah. Oh, what a beautiful note to end on. I'm glad when you mentioned about the big rocks. I remember the first time I saw that vase
Hmm.
exercise, right? That if you put in the big rocks first, or, how
Yep.
much you can fit in as opposed to the opposite. If we put the water in first and then the
Yep.
sand, then we have no room left for the big
Hmm.
rocks, the things that most of us would consider priorities. So where can our listeners learn more about you, Shamir, and what you do?
Yeah, they can certainly check up on me on LinkedIn. I would fathom to guess they will not find another Shamir Duverseau on LinkedIn. I'm feel pretty certain about that. So they can certainly search me up on LinkedIn. I have my own podcast they can follow up on LinkedIn and on Instagram as well. They can find clips of that too. So please connect with me. Let's have a conversation. Love talking about this and love being able to hear what other people have to share.
Yeah. Well, this conversation's been such a powerful reminder. I think that negotiation isn't about being louder or tougher. It's about being clearer, more intentional, and, ultimately more human. So thank you so much, Shamir, for bringing us such a really grounded and expansive perspective to the art of feminine negotiation for our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on the show. Having listened to it, it was great, and I was excited to be here, and I hope I offered something useful.
Oh, absolutely. I can't wait to get this episode shared. And speaking of which, to our listeners, thank you, of course, as always, for tuning in today. And there was so much value here. Make sure to subscribe, but equally, if not more importantly, give the gift of sharing. Pass this episode on to someone else who's maybe ready or needs to negotiate differently, whether negotiating with themselves or negotiating, personally, professionally across the spectrum. There've been some great golden nuggets here. So give that gift of sharing. And if you're seeking deeper support, whether one-on-one, in a group, or through self-paced learning, I'm here. Feel free to visit artoffemininenegotiation.com to explore some possible next steps for you. And remember, negotiation isn't a skill that you switch on and off. It's a way of moving through the world. So I encourage you, move with intention, move with integrity, and negotiate your life on purpose. Until next time, take care.